This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody. The ICS has only two named visiting fellows, the Webster Lecturer and the Trendall Lecturer. And we have them both in the room today because somehow we managed to schedule them just 1 week apart, but that's great because they can hear each other. A.D.Trendall is an exceptional figure in art history, and I think I first heard of him when in my first academic job when I was working in Magdalen College, Oxford, for Oliver Tappan, who's sitting there at the end of the row. And Oliver was near the end of a long period of leave and had that moment of sort of needing to get stuff done really, really quickly. And I remember he was writing Comic Angels at the time and running round and round saying, "This man Trendall, he's done everything, thank God he's there." And in those days, Trendall was there. Trendall isn't here anymore, sadly. But his work on Apulia vases and Greek vases in Italy is fantastically well known. And the fellowship that we named for Trendall is one that particularly asks people who have competent interest in the archaeology of South Italy and other things of that kind. And so there almost nobody would be better to fill it than Tom Carpenter, who is this year's Trendall Lecturer, also Charles T. Bring, Distinguished Professor of Classics at the University of Ohio. Tom has written a whole series of books on the representation of Dionysus in the Archaic Age, in classical Greece, the Master of Dionysus. So I think it's no big surprise that when he was going to talk, he would do something to do with Dionysus, as the phrase goes. It's been a great joy to have Tom as part of our community for the last few weeks. It's sad that it's coming near to the end, that he's about to jump off and fly back across the Atlantic. But it's been great having you here, and we're looking forward very much to hearing your lecture. Tom Carpenter, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a great pleasure to be here for me and also for Lynn, my wife. Can you hear me? I'm supposed to put this on.
A bit louder, I think.
All right.
For the ancient.
I get louder as I go on.
Oh, good.
More Dionysiac, I think. Tell me if you don't, because I think this speaker is supposed to be on. Is it on?
It's on, yeah.
Okay. It is, okay.
We can hear you perfectly here.
Good. I should start by acknowledging my debt to A.D.Trendall, without whose work my own studies of Apulia could not have gone forward. His attribution to painters and workshops on the basis of style of more than 10,000 Apulian vases, and his organization of those painters and workshops into rough but coherent chronology laid the groundwork for all future studies. While some may argue for the occasional reattributions and adjustments to chronology, RVAP, or the red-figured vases of Apulia that Trendall compiled with Alexander Kambitiglu, remains an indispensable tool for the study of Apulian pottery. And for me, it's a particular honor to be able to give the Trendall Lecture this year. One of A.D.Trendall's last publications was his important chapter titled On the Divergence of South Italian from Attic Red-Figure Vase Painting, in the book Greek Colonists and Native Populations, published in 1990, where his focus was principally on style and on shapes. Building on that, this evening, I would like to point to some other divergences from Attic red figure that have more recently come to light, and with those differences in mind, to explore the way they may point to meanings that Dionysiac imagery had for the people who placed the vases in tombs. The central question that frames this discussion is, what, if anything, can a rich visual tradition tell us about the beliefs and practices of a people from whom we have no written sources? And I should emphasize that what follows here is very much work in progress, and I really would be grateful for your comments once I'm finished. As Trendall and Campitiglu have shown the earliest South Italian red figure pottery was produced in Lucania, the area adjacent to Apulia to the west, as you can see here, probably around 430 BC. In all likelihood, the workshops were established by Attic potters or by locals who had been trained in Athens. Soon thereafter, Apulian workshops were established, and Apulian red figure quickly became the dominant fabric. Lucanian pottery appears in Apulian tombs until about 370 BC, after which Apulian vases entirely replaced Lucanian productions there. In what follows, I use the name Apulia for the ancient region of southeastern Italy that stretches along the Adriatic coast from the Gargano, this hump up here, down to the heel, and inland to the Bradano River. By the 8th century BC, 3 archaeological cultures can be distinguished here on the basis of local pottery and burial customs. And while ancient authors are, to say the least, inconsistent in naming them, we use the terms conventionally Daunians to the north, Messapians to the south, and Pucetians in the center. I've spent quite a bit of time studying things coming from Pucetia, and none of my colleagues, they all look rather blankly at me because they've never heard the word Pucetia before. So as an expert on Pucetia, I sort of stand alone. Messapic seems to have been the local language used throughout the area. Taranto, said to have been founded by the Spartans in 706 BC, was the only Greek colony in all of Apulia, and it controlled a hora with a radius of about 15 kilometers. Now, the traditional view of the manufacture of Apulian pottery following Trendall is that it was made by Greeks for colonial Greeks. Received opinion is that until about 330 BC, all Apulian red figure vases were made in Taranto. Though there's scarcely any archaeological evidence to support that assumption, there's no strong evidence that the pots were made elsewhere, so I'll simply leave the place of manufacture open, an open question for this discussion. What we do know, however, is that the Italic people, rather than the Greek colonists, provided principal markets. And I should say that I use the term Italic in what follows for the local people who lived in Apulia by the beginning of the first millennium, as opposed to the Greek colonists who lived in Taranto. The vast majority of Apulian vases for which we have reliable provenance has come from tombs related to Italic settlements. This point is an extremely important one as far as I'm concerned as we explore the possible meaning of Dionysiac scenes. Meanings for whom? Conclusions about the significance images may have had for the people who obtained them, if they're to be worthwhile, need to be as site-specific as possible. General statements about the implications of imagery from unspecified Apulian sites are of limited value, and furthermore, Italic settlements may well have had significantly different customs, practices, and beliefs. Scenes on some Apulian pots show warriors in different forms of Italic dress fighting each other, and they seem to point to what may have been uneasy relations between groups or settlements. And I'll return to these costumes in a few minutes. We know from literary sources of hostilities between the Italic people and the colonial Greeks, but hostilities between settlements or tribes, while not recorded, seem to have existed. For this discussion, I have chosen the territory of Ruvo di Puglia for 2 reasons. First, it appears to have been one of the richest Italic settlements in Apulia during the 4th century BC. And second, the number of figure-decorated vases known to have come from tombs in that territory is large. Though tombs at Ruvo were pillaged by collectors, particularly in the 19th century, Several Ruvestine families established collections of vases, most of which come from the territory of Ruvo. The Jatta collection is still in Ruvo. The Caputi collection has recently moved to Vicenza, and the La Gioia collection is now in Milan. Also, most of the Apulian vases from the temple collection in the British Museum are said to come from Ruvo. Recent archival research by Andrea Montanaro, an Italian scholar, has allowed the identification of groups of finds from more than 400 tombs that were often inexpertly excavated by locals in the 19th century. Tomb goods found in hundreds of tombs in Ruvo include armor, and I recently took this picture. This is a display of armor in the British Museum that comes from Ruvo, along with amber and gold jewelry, as well as Attic and South Italian red-figured pottery and wares. Corinthian and Attic black figure vases found in tombs indicate trade with mainland Greece at least by the early 6th century. The adoption of many Attic techniques and conventions by Lucanian and Apulian red figure vase painters in the late 5th and 4th centuries has often led scholars to see South Italian figure-decorated pottery as simply an extension of the Attic form. And when I started working on Apulian, that was my assumption. However, as we will see, attempts to read South Italian imagery as if it were Attic leads to misunderstandings and frustration. The language has changed. Even though many of the words seem to be the same, they've taken on different meanings. To continue with the language analogy, there are a multitude of falsi amici, or false friends. An awareness of this change is of particular importance in interpreting scenes that are not derived from myth, what are often called generic scenes, and this includes many hundred Dionysiac scenes. For non-myth scenes on Attic vases, there's often a reality that the images reflect, however imperfectly, one that would have been recognized by Athenians. All images are, of course, constructs, but the depiction of a symposium or a sacrifice, a wedding, mourners at a tomb, or this school scene would likely, for Athenians, correlate in some way with their own experiences that might be described in a narrative. In contrast, as we will see, the majority of Lucanian and Apulian non-myth scenes, though they usually employ recognizable Attic conventions, seem removed from an experienced reality. The images no longer provide a coherent narrative. Rather, details which would undoubtedly have spoken to the people who placed the vases in the tombs often seem to carry symbolic meanings that diverge from the apparent meanings of the Attic models. Superficially, they are grounded in Attic imagery, but the scenes are imaginative exercises with little connection to actual experiences of the people who obtained the vases on which they appear. Okay, that's in the abstract. The use of nudity and depictions of symposia are two of the clearest examples of this divergence from Attic red figure, and illustrate well the danger of reading Apulian imagery through Attic lenses. On Attic vases, nudity is reserved primarily for heroes, as here, for gods, and for athletes, and of course, for satyrs. Aside from those, there are very few Attic scenes where a figure is gratuitously nude. We can almost always recognize the reason for the nudity. Very seldom does a nude male, aside from a hero, appear with a woman. However, on Apulian vases, male nudity becomes the rule rather than the exception. In fact, naked youths appear on the majority of all Apulian red figure vases. And more often than not, we have trouble finding a comprehensible explanation for this nudity, as here. Why is this fellow talking to this woman without any clothes? When essentially we had the same scene of a departing warrior, this being an Attic scene, this being an Apulian one. Apulian painters use the red figure technique and use the same visual forms for depicting figures, but the words have taken on different meanings. Now, Apulian depictions of symposia provide another contrast with Attic imagery, and by symposium I here I'm referring here to depictions with two or more reclining figures, not a single figure reclining. A common subject on Attic pots, as here, depictions of the symposium itself are relatively rare on Apulian pots, and when they do appear, they are notably different from the Attic scenes, where depictions of symposia on Attic vases reflect in some way experienced events, I guess. Apulian depictions, or at least we can imagine, Apulian depictions are about imaginary occasions and are loaded with symbolism. Satyrs and even Pan can be present. A useful comparison can be made between two roughly contemporary vases from the early decades of the 4th century, found in Italic tombs at Ruva di Puglia, an Attic bell crater and an Apulian Dinos. On the Attic crater, four youths recline on two clini beds there, raising their cups in salutes to each other. And beside the beds or the clini are two tables with food on them. This is a continuation of a well-known pattern as on an earlier Attic column crater also found at Ruvo, where again 4 figures recline on 2 clini. There, one man plays kotabos, a drinking game where dregs of wine are aimed at a target on a stand, while the youth plays a barbiton. And I should mention, this stand is called a kotabo stand, and we'll come back to this in some of the Apulian imagery. And this fellow over here is playing a game called kotabos, where you have dregs in the bottom of your cup and you try and hit a target with it, which is what struck me as exceedingly messy, but was quite popular. Under the table beside each clina is a dog. There's nothing ambiguous about either of these scenes. All of the details are explicable as they relate to experiences an Athenian citizen would have understood. On the Apulian Dinos, which is here in the British Museum, 3 youths recline on a long mattress underneath a grapevine heavy with grapes. One youth, and you can see this is a detail of the pot itself. One youth holds a branch of some sort, another swings a kotabos cup, and a third holds a fiale. Each wears a different type of wreath or headband. 2 tables stand beside them, one with a cup on it and the other with a cantharos, a pomegranate, and eggs. This is a pomegranate, this is a cantharos, these are said to be eggs. And next to them is a basket with eggs. To the right of the youths, a woman, followed by a satyr with a situla, puts incense on an incense burner. You can't see that very well, but this is the woman. This is an incense burner here, and she's putting incense onto the burner, and just behind her is the satyr who's carrying a bucket, a situla with wine. And the incense burner, I should note, is an object more appropriate for a sacrificial scene and one that rarely, if ever, appears in Attic sympathetic depictions. And to the left, over here, you can see a woman plays pipes. Each of the details on this Apulian pot seems to carry meaning greater than itself, and the presence of the satyr removes it from the experience of mortals. The grapevine and the cantharos link it to Dionysus, and the pomegranate and the eggs point to the underworld. Turning now to Dionysus, we need to keep these changes in language in mind and be careful not to assume that Apulian Dionysus is Attic Dionysus. That people in Apulia in general recognized his association with wine and the theater is clear. But we need to explore what else he may have meant to them with Ruvo as our testing ground. In Athens, after about 420 BC, the Dionysus who appears on Attic vases is almost always, as here, a beardless young man, often naked. His hair is invariably long, and he often wears an ivy wreath, as he does here, and carries a thyrsus, which is a hollow fennel stalk with ivy leaves inserted into the top of it. Usually, he carries a cantharos, or someone in the scene does, and is accompanied by satyrs and women who dance. You can see the woman carries a cantharos over here and also holds a thyrsus. This is the Dionysus who appears on the Pronomos vase of about 400 BC, an Attic volute crater found in a rich tomb at Apulia. On one side, he reclines on a kline with a woman, presumably his partner Ariadne, amidst the cast of a theatrical production, which includes youths in satyr costumes, and I'm sure we're familiar with this plot. But on the other side, he moves off to the right with a woman, their arms around each other's shoulders, in a nighttime procession accompanied by satyrs and manic women. And we should probably see this as part of a narrative about the nuptial of Dionysus and Ariadne, and the presence of arrows with symbols supports this interpretation. You can see him flying along behind him over here. That the South Italian Dionysus is derived from such images of the Attic Dionysus seems likely. So, a similar Dionysus appears on a contemporary Apulian volute crater found in another rich tomb at Apulia. There, the naked god reclines in an upper register, while below, women prepare to sacrifice a goat at an altar beside an archaic statue of the bearded god holding a thyrsus. This is a statue of Dionysus. This is the young Dionysus reclining up above. A mask suspended above must allude to the theater. But a new element has been added here. Instead of a traditional ivy thyrsus, the young god holds a flowering narthex, a plant which grows in abundance in southern Italy. It is an attribute that never appears on Attic vases, but is often included in Apulian Dionysiac scenes. On another vase from the same workshop, found at Monte Scaglioso, the archaic statue holds a narthex as well. So here again, you have the archaic statue of Dionysus, but in this case, the statue is also holding this odd narthex. Throughout the 5th century, the ivy thyrsus is one of the most prominent attributes of Dionysus on Attic vases. It first appears there on red figure vases at the end of the 6th century, held by the god's female followers, as here, and later by the god himself. Throughout the 5th century, the ivy thyrsus is the sine qua non of Attic Dionysiac scenes, and the god himself usually wears an ivy wreath. Thus, the absence of ivy from most Dionysiac scenes on Apulian vases is noteworthy. More often than not, the thyrsus on Apulian vases is highly stylized, and its original construction from ivy leaves seems to have been ignored or completely forgotten. In fact, by the middle of the 4th century, the ivy thyrsus on Apulian vases has usually been transformed into a flowering acanthus stalk, which is what we have here. The thyrsus continues to be central in Dionysiac scenes, but its form and nature have changed, as may its meaning. So you can see where I'm going with this. Satyrs abound on Lucanian vases from the very start of production in the second half of the 5th century, but a figure convincingly identified as Dionysus does not appear at all on the pots of the earliest painters, and only occasionally on vases of the first generation of painters. It's only with the second generation of Lucanian painters, probably influenced by early Apulian painters, that Dionysiac scenes said to include the god appear with any regularity. Depictions of myths connected with Dionysus, such as the madness of Lycurgus or the death of Pentheus are rare on both Lucanian and Apulian vases. The vast majority of the scenes are generic. A nude youth, accompanied by satyrs or women with thyrsoi and tympana, appears on at least 1,000 Apulian, another sequence here. We've been there. Sorry. A nude youth accompanied by satyrs and or women with thyrsoi and tympana appear on at least 1,000 Apulian vases. And a tympanon, by the way, and I'll come back to this time and again, as you probably know, is a kind of drum. It's a skin stretched tight across a frame that's then beaten to make a drum-like sound. Trendall usually identifies the youth as Dionysus. And if he's to be understood as the god, he's the only deity to appear regularly on Apulian vases, aside from the equally ubiquitous Eros. There are, however, reasons to modify this identification. The scenes in which the youth appears, largely restricted to bell craters, most often take one of two forms. Either he sits in the presence of satyrs and women with tympana and thyrsoi, this has come out of there, with tympana and thyrsi as here, or he walks or runs in a procession of sorts. Sometimes he leads, sometimes he follows, and the procession can move to the left or the right, and torches appear, as we'll see, and seem to indicate that the scenes take place at night. The youth's hair, and please note this, the youth's hair is usually short, and he often wears a fillet of some sort on his head, as this youth does. On this bell crater, now in the British Museum, a short-haired youth follows a woman who carries a katago stand and follows a satyr playing pipes. Again, our katago stand is here. Aside from the thyrsus he holds, there's nothing about that youth that singles him out from the thousands of short-haired youths on other Apulian vases. The katago stand on an Attic vase would point to the preparation for a symposium, but on Lucanian and Apulian vases, it seems to take on different meaning. Rather than being an accoutrement of the symposium, the stand on Apulian vases seems to take on a more complex symbolic meaning, pointing to something beyond itself. So, for example, on a Lucanian bell crater, from Ruvo, a naked youth and a woman stand on either side of a blooded altar. He holds a thyrsus, she holds a katago stand and a fiala. This is her katago stand. The youth has a rather stylized thyrsus. This is an altar with blood on it, indicating that we had a sacrifice there. The scene is about sacrifice and has nothing to do with the symposium. On several bell craters, the youth, usually identified as Dionysus, sits on a chair as he swings a katago's cup with no sympathetic connections. More often than not, the stand is being taken someplace or, having arrived, is being prepared for the game. In another procession scene, a satyr with a torch moves to the left, followed by a woman with a tympanon and a naked short-haired youth who holds a wreath in his right hand. The satyr looks back and holds out an egg to the youth. The egg, with its funerary implications, makes it all the more unlikely that we should see this youth as the god Dionysus. On Attic vases, the distinction between real world, that is terrestrial scenes, and otherworldly scenes is usually clear. Satyrs do not appear in the presence of mere mortals, and it is reliance on the Attic convention in part that has led to the assumption that the youth on these vases must be Dionysus. But that convention does not apply in Lucanian and Apulian imagery, where satyrs can have many functions that have little to do with Dionysus, as on this bell crater where the satyr plays pipes for a naked young warrior. Rather, satyrs remove the scene from the terrestrial and place it in another world, and I think this is where we're going. All of the vases come from tombs, but there's nothing somber about the imagery. Rather, the setting on the craters can be seen as a joyous, imaginary world full of hope. The processions are headed someplace where wine is promised. Women or satyrs carry kotabo stands are going there too, pointing to the types of activities that will take place where satyrs with full wineskins will provide the fuel. I love this picture. It's as if this youngster has just appeared and has discovered this remarkable thing that's about to happen. I suggest that the images project the perception of a fantasy of an afterlife where one dwells for eternity in the presence of the god at an eternal banquet. An idea, obviously, which recalls Plato's mocking speculation in Book 2 of the Republic that in the underworld, those initiated into the mysteries, quote, pass the whole time in drinking with garlands on their head in the belief that the finest reward of virtue is to be drunk for eternity. This is Plato, this is not me. In fact, gold tablets deposited in graves in Greece and Italy from the 5th to the 3rd century BC lend credence to this vision of an afterlife as a traditional one. The gold tablets provide instructions to the deceased, presumably an initiate into the Dionysiac mysteries, on his or her journey after death. The late 4th century BC tablets discovered at Paulina in Thessaly in 1987 are particularly revealing, and I use Fritz Graf's translation. He says, quote, now you have died, and now you have come into being, O thrice happy one, on the same day. Tell Persephone that the Bacchic one is Dionysus. Tell Persephone that the Bacchic one himself released you. And it concludes, you had wine as your fortunate honor. And below the earth, there are ready for you the same prizes as for the other blessed ones. The procession scenes on Attic vases are surely Dionysiac, but the short-haired naked youths might better be seen to represent the deceased. Jumped again, sorry. Might better be seen to represent the deceased, where the worshiper has been assimilated, and this is my point, with the Attic conventions for depicting God. So the idea that the worshiper, the deceased, is assimilated using Attic conventions for depicting the god. And I should remind you that the god's hair is always long. All this is reasonable speculation, but we would be hard-pressed to call it evidence for an impact Dionysus might have had on the people who put the vases in tombs. Was it a jolly fantasy that after death you get to spend eternity in an unending symposium in the presence of the god as master of ceremonies, much as savvy Christians today might smile at images of St. Peter at the pearly gates? Or is there reason to think that in some way people thought that worship of Dionysus, perhaps initiation into his cult, had some impact on an afterlife as suggested on the gold tablets? In other words, was it a happy fantasy, or did it have some core in cult beliefs? And this is an issue I've struggled with for a long time. To address this question, I need to shift focus to a shape, an Apulian column crater, where the linkage, and this is important, the linkage between shape, imagery, and markets allows us, I believe, to connect vases with a specific group of people who chose to put the vases in tombs, connections we cannot make for any other shapes. Almost all Apulian column craters for which we have a provenance come from Italic tombs in central Apulia, Pucezia on the map, a great many having been found at Uva di Puglia. None has been found in any Greek site, and they are all but absent from Italic tombs in Messapia to the south. So they appear here, they don't appear in Greek tombs, and they never appear in this area where there are many, many Apulian vases. The attraction of the shape, the attraction of the shape seems to have been its similarity to a native shape, which was a large vase commonly placed in Pucetian tombs by the mid-6th century. And I should note that before about 360 BC, column craters represent only about 7% of all Apulian vases, only about 7% of all of them, and they come from the hands of relatively few painters, but those who paint them often paint many. The production of column craters seems to have developed as a kind of speciality aimed at specific Pucetian markets. Of particular interest, for our purposes here, is the fact that more than 75% of the Apulian column craters have warriors on them, while warriors rarely appear on other Apulian shapes. More important is the fact that most of those warriors wear distinctive Italic dress, a kind of self-representation, and in these scenes, they're protagonists. Before 360 BC, depictions of figures wearing Italic dress on Apulian vases are limited almost exclusively to these column craters. The majority of the scenes with these Italic warriors depict the departure of a warrior or warriors, a subject derived from 5th century Attic models. In the Apulian scenes, at least one woman is always present, usually pouring into a fiale or later sometimes a cantharos held by a warrior. The vessel she pours from is often a local shape, a trotzella or a nestor, as in this scene. This is the vase she's pouring from, which is not an Attic shape, but it's a local shape. Unlike Attic depictions of the departing warrior, an older male is rarely included in the Apulian scenes. The Italic people on these craters are distinguished from the Greek figures only by their dress and accoutrements. Body type and facial profile are the same. Male dress is the primary indicator. A wide belt is a common element in all male costumes, and such belts, as we will see, you can see them here and here, and such belts, as we will see, are found in Italic tombs. Male genitals are not exposed. Rather, as here, men can wear a short belted tunic of a kind, or a kind of triangular loincloth, both of which are decorated with various geometric designs. A conical hat with stippling on it that seems to indicate animal fur is often a common characteristic. That's what this is. People always ask, what on earth is that thing hanging from them? And this presumably, because we sometimes see them wearing them as well, this presumably is an animal skin hat. Spears, swords, and shields identify most of the males on the early Apulian vases as warriors. Most are beardless and their hair is long, as opposed to Greek warriors by the same painters whose hair is short. The connection between these column craters and actual warriors is demonstrated by finds from two rich tombs excavated in a necropolis at Gravina in Puccetia in 1988 and 1999. Each contained armor, including the wide bronze belt. This is a reconstruction of the tomb. In fact, it's all of the objects that were found in one of the tombs along with the skeleton. You can see this is the belt that goes across the middle of the body, and this is the rest of the armor. And each contained a column crater, and in this one, the crater had a depiction of warriors departing, which is over here. Alas, I couldn't get a picture of it. You'll simply have to take my word for it. Osteological studies have shown that the occupant of each of these tombs showed signs of wounds that would have come from combat. Warriors in italic dress first appear on column craters by early Apulian painters before the end of the 5th century and continue to appear on through the end of the 4th. The depictions of the dress are so consistent that one is tempted to assume that it refers to a garment worn by italic warriors or perhaps once worn by them. However, its continuous use by Apulian painters for over a century suggests to be that the meaning for italic people who obtained the vases may have been more symbolic than sartorial. So, with the early Apulian column crater, we have an image linked to a shape, linked to a specific market, which may have comprised an italic warrior class in central Apulia. Before 360 BC, it was a market that was quite different from the markets for other shapes. For example, Dionysiac imagery appears on nearly half of more than 500 bell craters, vessels of a comparable size from the same period, while it's all but absent from column craters. Conversely, warriors are all but absent from bell craters, while they appear on 75% of column craters. So I think you can see there's something very special happening here. After about 360 BC, there was an enormous increase in the output of Apulian red figure pottery, often accompanied by a decrease in quality. The nature of some markets appears to have changed. Before the middle of the century, figure-decorated pottery may have been a marker of an upper strata of italic societies, but later it appears in a broad range of tombs, at which point new huge vases with ever more elaborate imagery seem to have been designed for the rich, some of them 4 feet tall and more. After about 360 BC, the production of column craters increased along with other shapes. Where there are about 90 column craters in the 5 or 6 decades of Trendall's early Apulian, which ends in about 360, there are well over 200 assigned to the next 3 decades alone, and the proportion of column craters to others vases rises from about 7% to 13%. In other words, the market, which is still in central Apulia, in Prucetia, has expanded, but is still relatively small. Enough of those details. While Dionysiac scenes rarely appear on column craters before 360, during the following decade, they comprise close to 50% of the scenes, roughly equivalent to the number of scenes of italic warriors. Nothing about the Dionysiac scenes on these column craters after 360 distinguishes them from scenes on bell craters. They're all generic. Both Dionysiac and italic scenes appear in similar numbers at Ruvos. So in our test case, the Dionysiac scenes on column craters appear along with the warriors. But for our purposes, what is of particular interest during this period is the gradual introduction of Dionysiac elements into the traditional scenes with italic warriors after about 350 BC. 3 column craters from Ruvo illustrate this well, illustrate well this intrusion of the Dionysiac into traditional warrior scenes. On one, a woman with a wreath and a bunch of grapes stands in front of a seated warrior. Well enough to look on. This is the scene we're looking at. You can see this is a bunch of grapes in her hand. On another, an italic youth holds out a metal cantharos to his seated compatriot, while a woman to the right holds a wreath out over the head of the seated warrior. So here's his cantharos, here's his situla, and he's holding it out to his compatriot. The grapes and the cantharos can be seen as alluding to Dionysus. But it is the inclusion of the thyrsus, the preeminent Dionysiac attribute that uncontrovertibly refers to cult. It can have no other purpose here. And by the last quarter of the 4th century, the thyrsus has become quite common in these otherwise traditional scenes. So now we have the traditional warrior scene, and here you can see we have the thyrsus, which is again that symbol of the cult of Dionysus. This is the thyrsus, the acanthus thyrsus over here. while the warrior sits with his spears. This inclusion of Dionysiac elements in Italic scenes after 350 is too consistent to be accidental. Rather, it may represent a conscious expression of the place of cult in the lives of that small portion of the Italic community whose values and lives are reflected in the Italic warrior scenes. And here you can see a woman and the Italic warrior both have a thyrsus. The painter must be responding to the needs of that small market. The generic Dionysiac scenes that appear on both column craters and bell craters may express a similar, though perhaps less focused awareness of cult, specifically as it applies to an afterlife. All of these vases come from the tomb, and while some of them could have been used before deposition, the decision to include them in the tomb cannot have been a casual one. A common assumption in recent discussions of the archaeology of death and burial is that nearly every burial constitutes a highly symbolic act. Thus, graves and their contents need to be understood as symbolic communication. As has often been noted, the dead do not bury themselves, thus the choice of grave goods depends in large part on the living. With this in mind, I want to insist again that grave goods were not arbitrarily chosen and that the images on the vases placed in the tomb had meaning for the living. The prominence of Dionysiac imagery on craters from Apulian tombs for over a century seems to point to a deep-seated acknowledgement of the presence and power of the god in some segments of the Italic communities. Then, by the early 3rd century, the production of Apulian red figure vases had all but ceased, and thus we lose our source of Dionysiac imagery. But if we assume that the imagery was only one expression of the need, its absence need not mark the end of the god's presence in the lives of the people of Apulia. Livy's account of the Romans' difficulties in suppressing the Bacchic cult in Apulia after the Senatus Consultum of 186, not much more than a century after the last of our images, illustrates the continuity of what must have been a powerful cult. And in 181, Livy tells us, the praetor Lucius Duronius, to whom Apulia had fallen, was given the task of investigating the Bacchanalia, a matter in which lingering offshoots, so to say, of earlier evils had appeared in the previous year. The senators ordered the new praetor to wield the knife on this growth to prevent its creeping out again more widely. Thank you.